Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Yoon Jung Park. I am the program director for the Africa-China Initiative here at Georgetown, which is co-hosted by African Studies and Asian Studies. We are one of many co-organizers and sponsors of this event. But before, rather than my going into that, let me introduce my boss, our fearless leader, the Director of African Studies, Professor Lara Smith.
Thank you so much, Professor Park. I don't feel like your boss. I learned so much from you through all of this, and a colleague and friend, but thank you. Welcome to all. I can't do anything without notes anymore, and so I've brought some notes up that I forgot to print. But let me join Yoon in welcoming you this afternoon to our annual symposium. We're really delighted to have you here, and thank you to our panelists now and the ones that are to come for bringing your experience and your thoughts and comments and reflections to us, as we'll about to hear from. We have a lot of co-sponsors for this event, and that is, of course, a really good problem to have, to take a moment that I have to read them all off and have them written down, because it means that that there's a lot of collaboration and cross pollination and cross thinking about a topic that ought to be such, right? If we're not doing that with this topic, then we have a problem. So I'd like to begin by thanking the various units here and elsewhere that have helped to bring us all together today. So I'd like to thank certainly the Africa-China Initiative, which is hosted in the African Studies program here, and like to thank my colleague and friend, Professor Yoon Jung Park, who is the driving force behind that, for that and for the opportunity to work with you on this in the past, present, and future. And also in that, the Asian Studies program here at Georgetown, that is our co-sponsor for that. We are also hosted today by Georgetown Center for Latin American Studies as well, that was very eager to work with us, as well as the Georgetown Americas Institute, who we'll hear from in a moment. Really grateful for them. Georgetown's Initiative for U.S.-China Dialogue on Global Issues is also been a great partner in this event and others. Also, Howard University's African Studies Center, also partnering on this activity and others with us, so thank you to that. And joining us today are our colleagues in this activity and in the past in this activity, Michigan State University's African Studies Center and Michigan State University's Asian Studies Center. So thank you to all those partners, really a dynamic grouping of folks who work on these topics and issues. Just really briefly, want to say that we in the African Studies program, we're quite small, but we've been around for a while, and we're really proud and excited for what we do here at Georgetown. We've been here for 44 years. And we think a lot about these issues. We're lucky enough to be in a School of Foreign Service that thinks quite a great deal about regional studies, but we struggle, as many of us, I think, do in different ways with the kind of regional studies silos that if you have the good problem of having regional and area studies programs, which sometimes we don't have, but then you have the problem of sort of thinking about these areas and regions as discrete places, or in the disciplines of sort of thinking of them in disciplinary spaces and not across disciplinary spaces. And so certainly in the African Studies program, we try to foster these conversations that push us into conversations with our colleagues working in other parts of the world, as well as in other disciplines, and really make these transdisciplinary, transregional conversations. And then, as the themes of this point to in the terms of flows, to also think about across time, right? And the interdisciplinary work also pushes us to that in terms of thinking of long histories, presence, and future work, but really being intentional about that. So we're really excited about these conversations. And again, thank you for coming, and we look forward to your comments, both from the panelists and from those of you in the audience. I would like to also introduce my colleague from the Georgetown Americas Institute, Denise Yanovich, to also add her welcome. Thank you, Denise.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I won't take much time. I'm eager to listen all about your research. I got to hear some interesting thoughts about the group that is here today this morning, and I'm really looking forward to it. Thank you, Yoon, for inviting us to collaborate on this. The Georgetown Americas Institute, very briefly, is a very new institute at the university. We've only been here for 2 years. And it's collaborations like this that really help us amplify our impact. And we have a very broad mission. As I said earlier, we are tasked with elevating the presence of Latin America at Georgetown and bringing more conversations about Latin America to the university, but also taking Georgetown to Latin America and the region. And these types of collaborations really helps us in our broad mission. And another part of our mission is bridging academia and policymakers. So you'll see us focusing a lot on research that can really bring out recommendations for policymakers in the region. And yeah, I invite you to visit our website, and I'm not going to take much more time because I really want to listen to what you have to say. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lara and Denise. I remember when I lived in South Africa, which was home for many, many years. In between television shows, they had these continuity spokesperson. So please look at me as your continuity person today. We have an afternoon that's very, very jam-packed with amazing scholarship and insights and really deep levels of engagement on these issues. As you can see from the holding slide, the symposium is about Africa, Asia, and the Americas, connections and flows, both past and present. Our first panel focuses on the historical ties, and I'm really, really thrilled to introduce my dear, dear friend and colleague and mentor of sorts, Professor Jamie Monson. Jamie is a professor of history and the former director of the African Studies Center at Michigan State University. She's also former chair of the board of the Chinese in Africa, Africans in China Research Network, which we've worked on together for over a decade. So I'm really pleased to introduce Jamie. She's going to be chairing and moderating this session. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Yoon. And it's really a pleasure for me to be here. And gratitude and kudos to Yoon for pulling together this wonderful symposium, and to Georgetown for hosting us, and all the other partners and panelists who are here with us today. And I'm very delighted to be the chair and moderator of this panel on historical linkages. I think Yoon said yesterday, we'll start with the past, we'll start with history, and we've got 4 wonderful presenters. They'll be presenting in the order that they are in the program. And I've asked each of them to speak for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll have time for discussion. And I've been asked to just throw out a couple of starting questions at the end so that we can have some interaction and engagement with the audience. So our first presenter is Caitlin Barker. And Caitlin is a PhD candidate who's studying modern African and Chinese history. Her particular interest is in Africa-China relations. She's at Michigan State University, and she's looking at Cameroon's relationship with the People's Republic of China and Taiwan during the Cold War, viewed through the lens of knowledge production. So welcome, Caitlin.
Okay, it's wonderful to be here. I've learned so much from the last 2 days or day and a half of workshop. And I hope that my presentation can speak to some of the things that we've been talking about. I know I'm going to go home and revise my research though as well with some of the things that we've been discussing. So as many of you are likely aware, Chinese health diplomacy during the COVID-19 pandemic attracted a great deal of attention. We saw lots of coverage about how China was shipping vaccines and masks and other medical equipment all over the global south in the early period of the pandemic. But today, I would like to take us back in time to examine what a trans-regional methodology can teach us about the early days of Chinese medical aid to Africa during the Cold War. More specifically, I will discuss the intersection between diplomacy and the medical knowledge exchange that occurred between Cameroonian and Chinese healthcare workers during the 1970s and the 1980s. So in October 1977, Cameroonian President Amadou Ahidjo visited China for the second time. And during his visit, the Cameroonian and Chinese press ran several articles on the Chinese medical delegations that had been working at 2 Cameroonian hospitals since 1975. The Cameroon Tribune, which you see here, referred to China as the land of acupuncture and gushed in its coverage that, quote, public health is, without a doubt, the context in which Sino-Cameroonian cooperation appears most spectacular. And meanwhile, in China, in a Xinhua news article over there, the article recounted the story of Jacqueline, a Cameroonian woman who underwent a successful surgery under acupuncture anesthesia to remove breast fibroids. The article also recounted how the Chinese medical team saved a young boy who had been gored in the face by a bull, to the immense gratitude of his family and fellow villagers. This heroic act, according to the Chinese paper, prompted Cameroonian residents to observe that, quote, Chinese doctors love and serve the Cameroonian people. So in 1977, when these articles were written, Cameroon's alliance with China was still quite new, and the recent past was far less rosy than the tone of these articles suggests. In my dissertation, which is a bottom-up diplomatic history of Cameroon's relationship with China and Taiwan during the Cold War, I show that until 1971, there were competing alliances between two rival Cameroonian governments and two rival Chinese governments. As you can see here, from 1960 to 1971, Cameroon recognized only the Republic of China, or Taiwan. Meanwhile, the banned leftist opposition party, the Union of the Populations of Cameroon, maintained close relations with the People's Republic of China. And in 1971, President Ahidjo switched recognition to China instead of Taiwan, and this third alliance persists today. And it's this third alliance between China and Cameroon that I will be discussing. Today, I want to explore the crucial role that the Chinese medical delegations played in establishing and strengthening Cameroon's diplomatic alliance with China. Their work at two Cameroonian hospitals alongside Cameroonian healthcare providers constituted the first significant form of people-to-people interaction in this new alliance. While scholars have generally assumed that China influenced African knowledge production during this period in a one-directional display of power, I argue instead that Cameroonian healthcare workers and their Chinese colleagues provide an example of knowledge flowing in both directions. So to make these arguments, I draw on oral history and archival research in Cameroon, as well as Chinese and Cameroonian newspapers. Following recent innovations in Chinese history methods that have evolved as access to mainland Chinese state archives has decreased, many of the Chinese sources in this paper are what we call grassroots sources that I found and purchased from collectors in China. Here I am conducting an oral interview in northern Cameroon in 2022 with a retired nurse who learned acupuncture from his Chinese colleagues. So as I mentioned, most scholarship on Chinese medical aid to Africa focuses on the present. The historical studies that do exist have so far mostly been high-level, continent-wide ones written from the Chinese perspective, while the single-country case studies that do exist have focused on socialist governments that were early allies of the PRC, such as Algeria and Tanzania. But Cameroon represents a very different case. The first post-colonial Cameroonian government was decidedly not socialist. And as I hope to demonstrate to you all today, a trans-regional methodology can really deepen our understanding of this history. Putting Chinese sources directly into conversation with those from right-wing countries, such as Cameroon, complicates the traditional account of Chinese medical aid as socialist internationalism, or as some scholars have argued, as an attempt to export revolution. Rather, the right-wing Cameroonian government made specific demands of the Chinese medical teams and established clear parameters in which they were to operate. More broadly, therefore, my research challenges understandings of Africa-China relations as perpetually dominated by China, which persist in both US foreign policy and in scholarship, by demonstrating that they understate or ignore the experiences and agency of Africans in shaping their diplomatic alliances. So by the time the first Chinese health delegation arrived in 1975, the Cameroonian state was already quite practiced in navigating foreign medical aid. Archival documents from Cameroon's Ministry of Public Health make it clear that Cameroonian officials knew exactly what they wanted from the Chinese teams. They were primarily interested in having Chinese doctors train Cameroonian medical students and health personnel. In fact, the first Chinese medical delegation was sent to the Baomayo District Hospital, pictured here with the Chinese flag flying in 2022, specifically because of Baomayo's proximity to Cameroon's first medical school, which had opened in 1969. They hoped that the Chinese medical teams would teach techniques that Cameroon's existing Western medical aid partners had not mastered, notably acupuncture. The Chinese medical teams did provide assistance in the specific domains that the Cameroonian government had requested them to, notably acupuncture, radiology, and anesthesia. However, my sources reveal that these were not the areas where the most learning occurred. Instead, there was a robust exchange of knowledge that existed outside of these state-sanctioned domains. I'm just dropping these on the floor. I will first briefly discuss acupuncture as an example of an officially approved topic for teaching and learning. Then I will quickly cover abortion care and tropical medicine, two topics that proved highly fruitful for mutual learning, but which did not receive official approval from either government. Acupuncture appears to be the domain of Chinese medical assistance in which the desires of the Cameroonian government were most clearly realized, as it was here that they best coincided with the interests of Cameroonian healthcare workers and patients. My interviews made it clear that many Cameroonian healthcare providers did in fact learn acupuncture, both via on-the-ground training in the Balmayo and Guider district hospitals, as well as a handful of Chinese government scholarships for study in China. The learning process appears to have consisted primarily of hands-on practice combined with posters and books that included images of acupuncture points, which you see here. Several Cameroonian healthcare workers were given such images to keep, and they showed them to me during our interviews, along with acupuncture needles, which you can see here. Abortion care was decidedly not on the list of techniques that the Cameroonian government wanted their healthcare providers to learn from the Chinese medical teams. Abortion was then and is now illegal in Cameroon unless the life of the mother is in danger, but it is also relatively common in many communities and not particularly stigmatized. A retired Cameroonian midwife in Guider told me that the Chinese doctors would frequently perform abortions, although for a steep price. They would apparently always say that an abortion was justified to save the mother's life, even in elective abortion cases when everyone knew that this was not the case. 3 other retired healthcare workers confirmed this, and interviews in both sites pointed to abortion as one of the areas of learning for the Cameroonians. And one surgical nurse claimed that Chinese doctors would never perform abortions without the permission of the Cameroonian doctors on site. So in contrast with acupuncture, abortion care is a clear example of collaboration and learning between Cameroonian and Chinese medical staff that occurred beyond the purview of either government. And each interview I conducted yielded clear evidence that knowledge flowed in both directions. One retired nurse told me of showing his Chinese colleagues which plants are used in the traditional medicine of northern Cameroon. But by far the most common account was that the Cameroonian medical personnel taught their Chinese colleagues how to treat local endemic tropical diseases. They described the Chinese teams arriving with little knowledge of the most commonly seen ailments, such as malaria, typhoid, and amoebic dysentery. Indeed, these oral histories are confirmed by a 1977 interview in a Cameroonian newspaper with Dr. Chu, the head of the first Chinese medical delegation in Balmayo. Dr. Chu said that because the tropical diseases that are common in Cameroon were quite rare in China, his team arrived without a strong knowledge of how to treat them, and that this slowed their work in the beginning. This is further exemplified by a Chinese publication entitled Common Diseases of Cameroon, Data Compilation, which was published by the Shanxi Province Ministry of Public Health in 1979. Shanxi was the province that sent the first Chinese medical delegations to Cameroon, and the book is a collection of what the first team learned there. It includes sections on many tropical diseases, gynecological disorders, and pediatric health issues that patients presented with frequently at the hospitals in Balmayo and Guider. These include poisonous snake bites, amoebic dysentery, leprosy, fibroids, and African eyeworm. Several of the entries are handwritten, as you see here, and the font and format vary significantly between them, which I think highlights the piecemeal nature of the knowledge production. Some include detailed case studies of specific named patients, which you also see here, and hand-drawn tables and drawings pepper the accounts alongside the French and occasionally also the local Cameroonian language names of various ailments and medicines. The topics covered appear to reflect the genuine research interests of its authors. And apart from one brief section on schistosomiasis, none of the topics appear on the list of maladies or modalities that the Cameroonian government requested the medical teams to work on. In other words, the learning that happened at the day-to-day level in the clinic diverged significantly from the topics set out in high-level medical accords. I think this also presents clear evidence then that medical knowledge did indeed flow in both directions between Cameroonian and Chinese medical workers. Samuel Amuga Mbida, the mayor of Balmayo during the earliest years of the Chinese medical delegations, remembered these early delegations with great fondness. They worked with their heart, he recalled, practicing excellent medicine, and the people of Balmayo were very satisfied. And then he told me, with time, things changed for the worse. The care became commercialized, he said, and the quality deteriorated, so that by the time he fell seriously ill in 2007, he preferred to be treated at a hospital in Yaoundé, the capital, even though Chinese medical teams have remained in residence at the Balmayo District Hospital all the way to the present. This narrative of deteriorating and increasingly commercialized care from the Chinese medical delegations was repeated in nearly every interview I conducted. The first Chinese medical team arrived in Cameroon on the eve of major policy reforms in both countries. In Cameroon, the public health budget was severely cut in the early 1980s because of an economic crisis, which reversed much of the progress and investment of the early post-colonial period. So the deterioration of care that Balmayo and Guidère residents experienced was part of a much broader national trend. It was also, however, a result of changes on the Chinese side as well. China's new National Development Agenda of 1978 dramatically scaled back foreign aid, with Deng Xiaoping observing that, quote, "We now are still poor and cannot do much in proletarian internationalism," as the focus shifted squarely to domestic economic development. And I think we can see that this change was keenly felt by the recipients of Chinese medical aid. But in a 1977 interview with Dr. Mathieu Minkonda, the Cameroonian doctor in charge of the Balmayo Hospital, Dr. Minkonda emphasized again and again how seeing Chinese medicine up close had reinforced for him that medicine is universal. Although the Chinese teams were bringing new techniques, they were blending them with Cameroonian medical knowledge, and the result was a universal medicine that could cure people of both countries. As this new alliance between China and a right-wing Cameroonian government took the place of older anti-colonial connections with the banned leftist opposition party, the UPC, medicine took on an important new diplomatic role. Not only could both governments point to the medical teams as evidence that the new alliance was bearing fruit, but the mutual learning, sometimes outside of state-sanctioned domains, engendered long-lasting personal relationships as well as political goodwill, even after political reforms gutted their budgets. The Cameroonian healthcare providers worked alongside the Chinese medical teams to develop this universal medicine that blended both their expertise. And today they remain quite supportive of China-Cameroon cooperation, as do many of their patients. And that's all for today. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Ignatius Suglo. Ignatius is a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Advanced Research in Global Communications at the University of Pennsylvania. His research adopts historical, discursive, cultural, and ethnographic methods in engaging with visual, oral, and textual knowledge production and circulation about Africa in modern China, Africa-China media, and Cold War relations.
So great. Thank you very much, Yun, for the invitation. And today I want to share a portion of my work entitled Knowledge Production and Circulation of Africa in Mao China. And this is part of a bigger book project that is emerging out of my dissertation. And this experience today is very surreal because Jamie Monsoon was my external examiner on my PhD dissertation defense. And so this feels like a repeat of that. But in today's in today's talk, I will examine cultural and material circulations as specific mediation processes for how China it's happening already. For how China understood Africa, the world, and China's place in it. And I'll exemplify this by specifically examining the African presence in Chinese posters that were produced between the 1950s and the 1980s. And I'm taking posters as one of the early mediums of the Chinese broader population's visual interaction with the wider world. I explore the motivations for the appearance of Africans in propaganda posters, which was largely a domestic movement, and how and what these contributed to imaginaries of Africa through knowledge production and circulation. Great. So the posters that I'll be discussing today were produced and circulated in China between the early 1950s through to the late 1980s. And this period overlaps with the establishment of the PRC in 1949 through to Deng Xiaoping's economic reform. Geopolitically, this was during the Cold War. And on the African continent, this was a period of anti-colonial movements and independence struggles in various emerging nations. And then the competition for the third world within these emerging nations in Africa fueled support from various actors in terms of personnel, arms, training, to various factions that they thought or believed subscribed to one ideology or the other. And while the PRC was concerned with and worked towards nation building with media more broadly and propaganda posters specifically specifically playing a crucial role in this drive, it also paid close attention to its place and position in the world. Internally, this was crucial because the new China, Xinzhongguo, sought external recognition at a time when the old China, the ROC, the Republic of China, was overthrown and pushed to the island of Taiwan, but still had diplomatic relations with several countries on the African continent, hence contesting the legitimacy of this new China. On the other hand, the PRC saw itself as being in a long fight against imperialism that was still ongoing in parts of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And the Bandung Conference was one platform for demonstrating this commitment to decolonization and Afro-Asian solidarity that Mao had been championing through his Asia, Africa, Latin American Alliance 5 years prior. Posters were near omnipresent. They were found across streets, in workplaces, plastered along streets on the walls. They were used to brand matchstick boxes, caps, postal stamps, the back of mirrors, textbooks, among others. And these ensured that they were circulated to people of all ages and circulated widely. And I can talk more about the production of these posters during the question and answer session. Posters were adopted for nation building drives in China. The PRC came with it a new ideology of governance, socialism, in the creation of this new China. And it sought to teach the masses how to be good socialist individuals. And posters carried messages of role modeling, how to be good socialist, among others, and was a key form of mass media alongside public radio in the early years of the PRC. Posters were cost effective and were easily mass produced and circulated. The form afforded mass circulation that did not require infrastructure such as public address systems or radio receivers. One challenge at the establishment of the PRC was that literacy rate was only about 20%. And posters' use of images with short captions in simplified Chinese characters as opposed to traditional characters gave more people access to the messages that were circulated. So getting into Africa. Revolutionary discourse was the foundation or one of the foundations of friendship and subsequent diplomatic relations with not only independent and yet to be independent countries in Africa, but also in Asia and Latin America. These posters depict Africa, Asia, and Latin America as revolutionary friends, united under an assumed shared struggle. This construction relied on a dichotomy of friends and foes. And while friends were largely various nations in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, with a few exceptions, the foes were identified as American imperialists. And by the mid-1950s Sino-Soviet split, Soviet revisionists. Key here is that American imperialist, not America, is identified as the enemy. And this is to make clear support for Black radical movements in the United States at the time. It is also it's worth noting that there is no mention, at least by name, of France, Portugal, Britain, Spain, all of whom till the 1960s and 70s still had colonies in Africa, despite ongoing resistance. The closest reference to these actors is the occasional use of the term 殖民主义者, colonialists. And this raises the question of whose foe was being referred to here. Revolutionary posters largely drew on regional experiences from the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Taiwan Strait crisis, all of which had a significant American involvement. And posters of Africa focused more on an extension of China's fight against American imperial hegemony than with the actual enemies that various nations on the African continent were fighting. So some posters commented on events that were evolving on the African continent, such as the Congo crisis. This poster focuses on this Suez Canal crisis in the mid-1950s and critiques Britain, France, and Israel's involvement. They play the role of commemorating and documenting these revolutionary events, crises, and achievements, and were used to declare China's position on these events. The caption of this poster translates, a bit blurry, "Long live the national independent movement of Asia, Africa, and Latin America." And though the caption expands the scope, the imagery is rather specific because I did not find too many posters featuring North African subjects in circulation at the time. One thing that stands out, though, is the abundant representations of women in all aspects of life, as depicted by propaganda posters. And this was actually in line with Mao's first act upon coming into office, which was an enactment of a new marriage law in 1950, which prohibited arranged marriages, child betrothal, and emphasized free choice of partners. The implementation of these was, however, messy, and scholars have argued caused a lot of harm to the women that it meant to protect. Women's liberation in China was unified with that of the working class. And in an attempt to eradicate gender differences, women workforce, especially in revolutionary posters, dressed like men. This attempt not to see gender resulted in making masculinity the default by which Chinese women tried to fit in, thereby reinforcing the dominance of masculinity. However, viewed side by side, African women, especially in revolutionary discourses, are differentiated not only by their clothing, that is often marked, but also by reinforcing socially assigned maternal roles. So in this poster, for instance, an African woman is armed with a rifle and a determined demeanor, but carries a baby on her back. The geographical choice of women represented is also largely from sub-Saharan Africa, whereas a few posters do have men from Algeria through Egypt represented. For over a decade and a half of propaganda poster production, at least until the Cultural Revolution in the mid-1960s, posters that focused on the foreign did not feature Mao or references to him. And this was in line with emphasis on the masses in the revolution. And as such, even in posters of African revolutionary movements, leaders of these movements were not often depicted. Mao, however, becomes central in all posters, including those of the foreign, during the Cultural Revolution, characterized by Mao personality cults from the mid-1960s to the mid-1970s. Posters highlight Mao as the figurehead of the world's revolutionary movement in an extension of China's discourse of revolution. Hence, again, no image of African revolutionary leaders are featured, but an oversized image of Mao as the red sun over revolutionary movements, as suggested by the caption of that poster. A closer look at this poster reveals that the angle of interaction, so it's slightly from bottom up, right? So making these actors look slightly dominant and powerful, one other form of interpretation. And this idea is also, supported by the artillery that they wield. But this angle of interaction, however, allows us to see the title of the book that they are reading, which is Selected Works of Mao Zedong. While reiterating Mao's ideology in liberation struggles, by the caption which reads, Mao Zedong 是世界革命人民的大救星. Chairman Mao is the savior of the world's revolutionary people. And this suggests an unequal power relations between Africa and China expressed through ideological dominance as shown in the image. It's not the people fighting, but Mao through the little red book, the other name for Selected Works of Mao Zedong, that is saving revolutionary people. But these references are also abundant in that, we see this gentleman wearing a PLA style uniform, wielding a Chiang Kai-shek rifle, and this gentleman with a grass hat wielding a spear standing next to him. By the late 1960s, China increasingly became more engaged in activities on the African continent. Official visits increased. African students were sent to study in China as part of bilateral relations. And there is also an increase in depiction of China's projects and initiatives on the continent. More varied themes beyond revolution and more discernible features of Africans in posters begin to emerge. Medical aid depicted Chinese medical personnel, often referred to as barefoot doctors, in African communities. The term referred to part rural healthcare worker, part peasant who worked in rural communities in China. The reference to healthcare workers sent to African countries as barefoot doctors, on the one hand, suggests a similarity of the continent to rural China. It evokes a sense of distance, while revolutionary posters sought to construct proximity. There's an ambivalent portrayal of Africa, both as a close comrade and a distant other. These posters showcase African agency as African doctors are shown to work with Chinese healthcare workers, leading to knowledge exchange, as Caitlin rightly expanded on. And even in non-revolutionary posters, Mao's saviorhood is still internationalized by duplicating domestic discourses onto foreign subjects. So as seen in this poster with a barefoot doctor with a group of men and women and children, supposedly African, literally looking up to the image of Mao with a caption that says, Mao Zedong once, so long live Chairman Mao. But this is contrasted with posters on the Tazara Railway, which were mostly produced by art groups of railway construction companies, which, unlike medical engagement, some of these posters do not take into account the numerous skilled and unskilled local workers who worked on the project, as Jamie's research on the Tazara has shown. So in this poster, we have an outsized image of a Chinese railway construction worker foregrounded, while several people, including Africans, are in the background. So they're jumping. During the Great Leap Forward, which was an unsuccessful socio-economic campaign to ramp up agricultural production and industrialization within a short period of time through mass mobilization. But this ambition was, however, complicated by famine in the late 1950s and early 60s. And in recovering from unspeakably hard times, there was a need to instill hope. Hence, we begin to see numerous depictions of domestic life, flourishing economy, happy people, advanced transportation networks, theater arenas, and major industrial infrastructure. And we see a depiction of a life hoped for. And this life, often than not, had friends from afar, as in this, visiting foreign friends, bearing witness to this flourishing China. But following the death of Mao, the Communist Party grappled with how to present its history, especially of devastating moments, such as the Cultural Revolution and policies such as the Great Leap Forward, all of which posters played a key role as mass media in, without decimating the memory of Mao. And a shift in media form was one convenient way to avoid engaging with these memories. But this was convenient as television saw rapid development in a decade. And by the mid-1980s, television reached 2/3 of the population. And state sponsorship for posters also were on a significant decline. So posters of African representations within the framework of propaganda posters either sell an ideal of utopian representations of society, an ideology, communism with Chinese characteristics, or served as mediated sites of meaning making as mass media. The African presence in visual discourse forms part of a China narrative, particularly one of internationalizing revolution, but also begins to shift from the ideological to more concrete actions of China in Africa. And they tell us more about China than they do about Africa. There is little about work and life in African representations, which shows the focus for China. Some of these posters veers from popular narratives of Africa while focusing on themes that were pertinent to China's continuous revolution and quest for recognition as ideological leader of the third world. But this narrative, however, served to make the narrative of help the dominant narrative of the African continent, even in contemporary discourses of Africa-China relations. Thank you very much.
Lovely to see these two presentations on knowledge production, very richly historicized. And our next panelist is Yasser Ali Nasser, who is a PhD candidate in history at the University of Chicago. His work explores the intersections between post-colonial nationalism and new internationalist impulses that emerged in Asia in the wake of the Cold War.
So thanks first off to Yoon for inviting me to be part of such a great event and to be part of this excellent panel. I'm very happy to be here and learn among such excellent scholars. So to just jump into it, today I really want to talk about these ideas of Asia which circulated in India and China in the 1950s as a way to really try and understand how a region is actually conceptualized and forms and the different variants that it can take on the way to eventually becoming a vehicle for what we could call trans-regional thought or solidarity. So beginning in the early 1950s and continuing until the end of the decade, state and state-adjacent organizations in India and China exchanged delegations, hosted massive conferences, conducted signature campaigns, and enacted legislation in the hopes of what they called, pursuing what they called friendship. Regarding one such delegation in 1956, Wu Han, who was then the vice mayor of Beijing, a prominent historian and the delegation's appointed leader, recognized that the two countries had traversed what he called different paths since they had established their independence. Instead of serving as a barrier to their relationship, though, those differences encouraged mutual learning and respect. So as Wu Han reiterated in his speeches to large crowds in Delhi and political committees in Beijing alike, both countries shared a long history of peaceful cultural, economic, and political exchange, and had made, quote, the Far East and the world's lasting peace our common goal, despite their differences. So emphasizing their shared bonds and history, Wu declared that this commitment to peace and tolerance would ultimately serve as the foundation of a friendship that could be, as, quote, as high as the Himalayas and as deep as the sea. But by emphasizing the different paths that India and China had opted for in the years following their attainment of sovereignty, Wu and others like him tacitly acknowledged that there was something about this friendship between India and China that didn't really seem readily natural. Respecting differences meant acknowledging that such differences existed and that they were significant enough to potentially threaten the prospects of solidarity. So as such, this relationship had to be justified and contextualized. We thus have to ask how they did so, what made India and China alike or different in the first place. So to give a bit of background, usually we've seen this period of so-called friendship as either a smokescreen for simmering geopolitical tensions, namely those over Tibet, or as the product of personal relations between Indian and Chinese statesmen, namely Prime Minister of India, Jawaharlal Nehru, and the Premier of China, Zhou Enlai, pictured there. As the traditional narrative goes, these were two wildly different states with different foreign and domestic policy objectives, and so any friendship that supposedly existed between them was doomed to fail from the beginning, and in 1962, they actually went to war. What I think is lost, though, in that story is that despite its relative brevity, this project of friendship brought the two largest and most populous post-colonial states together despite their ideological differences, with India being a liberal democracy and China a revolutionary socialist state, at a time when the Cold War should have really driven them apart from the get-go. Nor was friendship limited to the dealings of statesmen at the highest levels, with delegations throughout the 1950s totaling thousands of members with wide interests constantly going across the border. So to better understand what's going on here, I'll need to start off with some definitions. So as a form of political solidarity, friendship specifically was often invoked by the Soviet Union in the context of building closer relations with socialist parties in Europe in the immediate aftermath of the October Revolution, and following World War II described what we now call people-to-people diplomacy within the socialist bloc, which often stressed the need for involving regular citizens and not just officials in diplomatic overtures like delegations and cultural exchanges. So friendship was really heavily associated with revolutionary socialist politics. But that definition doesn't really quite fit in the case of Sino-Indian friendship. Something else anchored their relationship. Wu Han referred to it as their common interest in the so-called Far East, and others simply said it was their status as so-called Asian countries. So what was the Asia that they actually referred to? This was one that was largely steeped, I think, in a sense of historical trajectory. So emerging from the colonial past, as in this map here, and stepping into a liberated future, which by December 1949 seemed imminent, in a way that was not entirely different from the Pan-Asian ideologies that we saw proliferate for much of the 20th century. But what made the use of Asia in the context of Sino-Indian friendship particularly novel was the Cold War. Western-led interventions in Korea and Southeast Asia, nuclear tests in the Pacific, security pacts throughout the continent, these aspects of Asian geopolitics contrasted with the process of decolonization and successful anti-colonial struggle, which had been accelerating in the aftermath of World War II. So in other words, Asia is being defined here broadly as encompassing those societies that had experienced colonialism and war throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, and as they were now emerging onto the world stage as independent nation states, were suddenly met with the Cold War order that treated Asia as basically one of its main staging grounds. So this conjuncture of Cold War anxieties about renewed war brought on by bloc conflict and post-colonial dreams of a more equitable international order produced friendship between India and China as a form of solidarity that really stressed the differences, the importance of acknowledging and respecting mutual differences as opposed to eliding them or enforcing strict ideological homogeneity. In the aftermath of the Chinese entry into the Korean War and as fears spread in India of a larger regional conflict, an eclectic group of academics, ruling Congress Party members, communists, and journalists began to set up disparate branches of what they called the India-China Friendship Association. These India-China Friendship Associations explicitly opened themselves up to members who were not just leftists or with an interest in revolutionary politics, but had a general interest in, quote, the oppressed millions of Asia, for whom they saw China to be a clear inspiration, noting that an quote, interchange of ideas and practical programs, irrespective of political or other affiliations, will be necessary for our countries to navigate this increasingly complex international climate, end quote. So in other words, as the Bombay branch put it, friendship between India and China would be the biggest guarantee of peace and freedom for all the Asian people. So subsequent calls for both countries to learn from one another, not one from the other, but together, meant that not just learning from Chinese revolutionary politics, but rather to also teach China something of India in return. So these branches opened to much fanfare in the Chinese press, and in April of 1951, Song Qingling, who was Sun Yat-sen's widow and an important leader of the new Chinese state by her own right, wrote to the Bombay and Calcutta branches of the ICFA, commending them for their efforts and reiterating that the two countries were so-called sister republics who now faced a world in which imperialism is rapidly dying. So in such a world, the two countries could unite to secure the final and powerful realization of people's rule in Asia. So this accompanied a gradual realization from the Chinese state that India, which had been one of the first non-socialist countries to recognize the PRC, could be a very useful supporter in its attempts to win recognition from the international order. So such pronouncements led to the trading of several so-called unofficial delegations between the two countries, which, while nominally not including representatives from either government, still operated with both states' approval and only really helped to solidify this notion that the two countries were similar despite their differences. And this similarity was again broadly construed as Asian, which they defined by their shared struggles against imperialism, both past and present, and their emphasis on nation building. So committed to furthering this relationship in order to heighten its own prestige as a country capable of operating across different political boundaries and lines, the Indian government sent its first official delegation to the PRC in 1952 to really build on these previous people-to-people connections. And it was led by none other than Nehru, the Prime Minister's sister, and prominent diplomat Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit. To mark the occasion, Pandit and her colleagues were invited to and joined the inaugural conference of the China-India Friendship Association, or the Zhongguo-Indu Youhao Xiehui, which was one of the first Chinese friendship associations established to build goodwill with a country outside of the socialist bloc. Speaking of the conference, prominent academic and people-to-people diplomat in his own right, Guo Moro, outlined the political importance of Sino-Indian friendship. It highlighted the reality that, quote, nations can coexist peacefully and attain progress in common, so long as they maintain a spirit of unselfishness, render material aid to each other, and exchange experiences in cultural development. If all the nations of the world will do as we do, then world peace can be consolidated. So such rhetoric was powerful in an era when anti-communist narratives about the PRC presented it as a country seeking to export revolution to all of its neighbors or to dominate them militarily. By engaging with Asia's other largest country, a liberal democracy that was leading the charge for the neutral and the non-aligned in the region, the Chinese state and its interlocutors could argue that Sino-Indian friendship was proof of its peaceful intentions. So the Zhongyan Youxie would go on to become the Chinese state's go-to liaison for arranging receptions for Indian delegates and organizing delegations of their own to India. In time, encouraged by an Indian state eager to have its own state-aligned and centralized friendship association as opposed to disparate branches, the leaders of the ICFA branches in India came together to form a national committee capable of coordinating their activities on the national level. And they had a conference in December 1953, which the Zhongyan Youxie likewise sent a high-level delegation in order to support. So the conference featured a lot of high-profile speakers that I won't get to, but most important for our purposes is Kaka Kalelkar, who was a famed Gandhian activist and prominent Indian politician, and served as a founding member of the ICFA and was the conference's headline speaker. So welcoming the Chinese delegation personally, he first contrasted the relationship between their countries with the security pacts that were then spreading throughout Asia, such as the one signed only days earlier between Pakistan and the United States, which he said exhibited, quote, the tendency of one man or one group attempting to impose his will or its will on others. Instead, by proclaiming the necessity of mutual goodwill, cooperation, and learning, India and China could foster honorable multiracial cooperation, which should be an example for all of Asia's teeming millions and the whole world. So Kaka was not the only speaker at the conference to suggest that India and China's friendship was a model for Asia to follow. Indeed, most of the ICFA's leadership really cast friendship in such terms, which is that both countries are fundamentally Asian countries, but this sense of Asianness is not bound by older models of racial unity or an essentialist list of Asian values, but rather, as Kaka put it towards the end of his speech, it is our duty to unite Asia. The unity of Asia is not meant for aggression against any other country. Asia's unity is a painful necessity. We have suffered from over a century from Western aggression, and some of us are still suffering. It is this common misfortune and danger that unites us. Thus, both of us have to work out a common destiny for the whole of Asia, and through Asia, the destiny of the whole world. Let us learn from each other, let us love each other, and let us learn to serve humanity together so that we may establish friendship between races, cultures, and ideologies. So in other words, friendship between India and China was really meant to be this vehicle for a new type of solidarity, the celebration of cosmopolitanism and ideological diversity. So such statements took Guo Moro's earlier notion that Sino-Indian friendship proved that nations could coexist one step further. They attributed this capacity for peaceful coexistence to a so-called Asian history of anti-colonialism. As a visiting delegate from China put it at the conference, because of the two countries' shared history of fighting colonialism and their shared present incentives in maintaining a peaceful Asia, Sino-Indian friendship would not be, quote, the kind of alliance of nations which harbors evil designs towards other peoples in the world, but would rather strive to help both countries be useful to each other's peaceful national construction. So beyond Asia, Kalelkar even mentioned then accelerating anti-colonial struggles in Africa, hoping that by reviving together, China, India, and Asia could help shape a new international order that would eventually extend to other new nation states and regions. So in this sense, if Asia was defined by a certain relationship to colonialism and present-day crises, Africa could also be Asian. So in contrast to Cold War blocs and colonial empires alike, Sino-Indian friendship's promise of unity did not mean pursuing hegemony. Like Wuhan, the ICFA's leaders maintained that India and China were very different countries and with very different political agendas. But they also argued that by embracing those differences and by learning from them, the two countries could create a world capable of resisting the logic of Cold War era geopolitics. So the visions of Asia that circulated in India and China in the aftermath of the ICFA and Zhongin Youxie's collaborations would in time form the core of ideations about Afro-Asia and the Third World as well. The two countries' friendship was eventually made official when Prime Minister Nehru and Zhou Enlai announced in 1954 that their relationship and foreign policy more generally would be forever dictated by what they called the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence: mutual respect for sovereignty, mutual non-aggression, mutual non-interference in internal affairs, equality and mutual benefit, and peaceful coexistence. So this vision of a horizontal relationship, one dictated by respect and not hegemony, was precisely the one that advocates of friendship had argued for years. And those same principles would go on to be adopted by the participants of the famed Afro-Asian Conference at Bandung only a year later, and would remain a guiding set of principles for many nation states emerging from colonialism and hoping that they too could make a better and friendlier world. All right, I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Last but not least, I'd like to welcome Laura McDonald, who's our last speaker. And Laura is an assistant professor at Michigan State University. She's in the residential college in the arts and humanities. Her research focuses on Broadway musical theater history, theater production and marketing, audience and fan studies, and transnational music theater history in Europe and East Asia. Welcome, Laura.
Should I take your microphone? Thank you. Okay. I'm a scholar of American theater. This is my first attempt to put together archival and oral history collected in Japan, archival material. So please be gentle. And there's only a passing reference to China. In a 1984, sorry, I forgot about my train. This is a very beautiful Japanese train. This is the Hankyu train. This is the train company that owns the Takarazuka Review Company that I'll be talking about. I rode this train to the archive. So join me. Let's get on the train and head through Japan. In a 1984 article for Asian Theater Journal, director and scholar of opera and operetta Hironori Terasaki surveyed trends in Japanese theater and confirmed almost all the major musicals from the United States are lavishly produced with immense budgets in Tokyo. But some Western musical theater scholars have suggested that when the mega musicals Cats and Les Miserables were first imported from London in the 1980s, there was little interest in Western-style musical theater in Japan, and that British producer Cameron Mackintosh opened up a new market in the East, with Japan being a particularly strong market. Such conclusions are drawn without any meaningful evaluation of musical theater in Japan prior to the 1980s, preserving the notion of the metropole and the periphery. And yet, as the Takarazuka Review Company's experiments with international content and collaborators demonstrates, there was in fact serious Japanese interest in Western-style musical theater, and as a result, an existing domestic market expanded as knowledge and skills were further developed. As this paper explores, such growth established industry infrastructure and an audience base while continuously maintaining transregional exchange over many decades. Originally founded in 1914 by the Japanese railway and department store magnate Kobayashi Ichizo to increase interest in the town of Takarazuka's hot springs and encourage travel on the railway line leading into Osaka, the Takarazuka Review grew from a youth chorus group into a company with 5 all-female troupes and 2 theaters. Attracting 2.5 million spectators annually by the early 21st century, the company's 400 female performers play both male and female roles, as you can see in these photos. In musicals typically set in the West, that's Guys and Dolls on the left, which makes the majority of Takarazuka performances transregional, as spectators in Tokyo or Osaka enjoy stories set in Europe or the US. The performers are known as Takarasyen from the time they begin their studies in the company's own school, where their casting as male role otokoyaku or female role musumeyaku performers is determined based on their height, physique, facial shape, voice, and personality. Theater scholar Makiko Yamanashi explores how Takarazuka adopted foreign elements while conforming to familiar domestic criteria and values in the 1920s and 30s. And the review made its first international tour to Europe in 1938. American and Asian tours followed in 1939. Takarazuka review writer and director Utsumi Shigenori clearly built on this tradition of international influence and engagement and was one of several pathbreakers in Europe and East Asia who helped to establish multipolar routes by which musicals and theater professionals would increasingly cross borders in the post-war era. Born in Osaka in 1915, just 2 years after Kobayashi established the Takarazuka Review, Utsumi grew up in nearby Kobe and commuted to school by train on the Hankyu train line. He often saw Takara-sien commuting, and he and his peers eagerly anticipated spotting the girls. After graduating from high school, he became more invested in the Takarazuka Review, establishing a fan club with friends, and by 1941, he was working as a writer and director of Takarazuka Productions. His early credits included Autumn in the Highlands, The Rose of Granada, Boogie Woogie Paris, and Under the Southern Cross, about a Brazilian theater troupe. So before even leaving Japan, Utsumi had used the Takarazuka stage to travel the world and was ready to follow the characters he created on his own adventure to New York City at the end of 1951. In Takarazuka's magazine Kageki, Utsumi shared with readers that he was not overwhelmed at all and that going to the United States was, quote, like going to Tokyo now that Japan has a close relationship with the US, end quote. Utsumi anticipated visiting Radio City Music Hall to study the Rockettes, as well as cabaret venues to learn from international performers. After stops by passenger liner in Hawaii and San Francisco, Utsumi flew to the East Coast. He called New York City, quote, the place of my dreams. The rapture of coming to New York makes me forget every anxious feeling, end quote. While the Rockettes were not as synchronized as he'd heard, Utsumi was especially excited by the use of amplification, commenting in multiple articles about the new technology used on Broadway. Observing and reflecting on the similarities and differences between Takarazuka's practices and the American entertainment industry, Utsumi reassured his readers that the Takarazuka Review is no different from the musical in New York City, but we have deficits in that their actors are skilled and the show is always lively. Utsumi's research in New York City was the primary means at Takarazuka's disposal for exploring new trends in musical theater practice. He highlighted the musical Guys and Dolls and was particularly startled by a production of George Bernard Shaw's play St. Joan, starring the German-American actor and master acting teacher Uta Hagen. In Kageki magazine, he wrote, they act by moving their own emotions and create new things by boldly breaking the rule. I want to do this as much as possible with my direction. So decades before Western scholars identify any meaningful musical theater activity in Japan, Utsumi was already processing a wide and eclectic range of trends and techniques that would inform Takarazuka productions for years to come. He stayed in New York City for more than a month until Takarazuka called him back. Oh, where are my other slides? Oh, we'll go back here. Takarazuka called him back to Japan to begin working on a new show called Broadway. That opened 5 weeks after his return from the US. The production's loose story was set in Greenwich Village and centered on a love triangle with an aspiring Broadway actress. The set featured a Times Square-inspired backdrop reminiscent of the set design for Guys and Dolls. The performers also used handheld microphones for the first time in Japan. Some critics found the story somewhat thin and wondered if it was a copy of American musical theater, but others concluded it was Takarazuka's best new work in some time and commented positively on the use of microphones. Utsumi considered it the first attempt, a trial run, a souvenir of the trip in which I only saw the surface of America. American writer James Michener visited Takarazuka later in 1952, conducting research for his novel Sayonara, published the following year. It tells the story of an American GI stationed near Osaka who falls in love with a Takarazuka star. An American film adaptation of the novel changed the setting to Kobe and was released December 5th, 1957. By December 17th, the international touring plans of Takarazuka and other all-female Japanese theater troupes were reported by Western journalists. Takarazuka received interest from France and Hawaii, but Kobayashi had been in talks with an American promoter since 1956, and a 36-city U.S. tour followed, directed by Utsumi. During his first visit to New York City, Utsumi proudly shared photographs of Takarazuka performers and made a note of Americans' strong reactions to colorful kimonos worn as costumes by the Japanese women. Americans are looking for something rare, so Japanese beauty will work well, he observed. Between July and November of 1959, 42 Takara Sien and 10 staff members crossed the Pacific and toured the United States, often selling out and generating much positive word of mouth. A stop at my own university in East Lansing, Michigan is now suggesting new avenues for my continued exploration of this multipolar musical theater exchange. These performances occurred across the street from the building where I teach. And these documents were found in the Michigan State University archives. But musical theater traffic was not moving only in one direction from Takarazuka to the United States. American directors, choreographers, and performers began arriving in Tokyo in 1963, launching a flurry of Broadway musicals and occasional American touring productions. The New York City-based dancer, choreographer, and teacher Nomura Yeiichi founded the Ballet Art School at Carnegie Hall in 1940 and eventually advised Takarazuka, facilitating negotiations for the company to stage the Japanese premiere of Richard Rodgers and Oscar Hammerstein's Oklahoma with Agnes DeMille's original choreography. Jemsy DeMille on the left had known Nomura since her childhood dance classes with him, and she went on to perform on Broadway and assist choreographers like DeMille and Jerome Robbins, eventually setting up performances of Oklahoma and The King and I as far away as Germany and Australia. She was a logical choice for her former teacher to recruit on behalf of Takarazuka. Nomura predicted, if this Oklahoma works, Takarazuka will likely do another one. He told Delap about Kobayashi and the history of the all-female company. Delap had no concerns regarding the language, anticipating that rehearsing Japanese performers would be similar to her experience staging The King and I with Germans. She predicted, the Japanese are very emotionally attuned to Americans' quality. I think it's easy for them to feel an American style. She arrived in Japan on May 10th and 2 weeks later, wrote to Nomura on Takarazuka Hotel Stationery, reporting that the work is going very well because the girls are talented and willing. Communication is painfully slow and exhausting, but it's coming, so I feel confident we will have a really first-rate production. Retired Takarazuka performer Natsumi Yoko was in the ensemble, and in an interview with me last year in New York City, she confirmed how easy she found it to work with Delap, explaining how the director's detailed demonstrations helped to overcome any language barriers. At Delap's instruction, makeup artists applied bronzer and smudges of dirt to the male role players in an attempt to represent real suntanned American cowboys. Natsumi, the female role player, also performed in Takarazuka's West Side Story in 1968, staged by the American Sammy Dallas Bayes, and you can see him on the right swinging a punch. While in Japan, Bayes studied traditional dance forms with Takarazuka teachers. Natsumi recalled being one of several female role players who began every performance of West Side Story playing a white American jet girl through to the dance at the gym number, after which she and others applied brown makeup to continue the performance as Puerto Rican shark girls. After retiring from Takarazuka, Natsumi continued acting, then immigrated to the United States, where she eventually performed in a musical theater adaptation of Michener's Sayonara. Trans-regional collaboration and exchange became the norm for Takarazuka. As a tourist in Vienna in 1992, Otokoyaku star Maki Ichiro saw a new Austrian musical about the Habsburg Empress Elizabeth, exploring her fascination with death, personified by a male actor, and that's Death holding Elizabeth on the right. Maki desperately wanted to play Death in Japan, and within 4 years, a Takarazuka production brought the musical to Japan. Other Japanese productions followed, and East Asian interest in European musical theater expanded. There's Maki as Death and a poster for a Takarazuka production. A Korean premiere took place in 2012 and continued to return in Korea, and Asian theater fans began traveling to Europe to see productions of this musical with European cast members. And eventually in 2014, an Austrian production of Elizabeth toured to China. Such exchange and influence continued to be multipolar. Takarazuka fan Uchida Teruko was working in Tokyo in the 1950s when she fell in love and married Larry Paulus, an American soldier directing shows to entertain servicemen at the Ernie Pyle Theater on the left, where renowned Japanese dancer and choreographer Ito Michio also worked. Uchida and Paulus settled in New York City and had 3 children, the youngest of whom, Diane, became a theater director. In 1989, Paulus, in her 20s, accompanied her mother to see Takarazuka perform on tour at Radio City Music Hall, and she was fascinated. She studied the company, aided by a documentary film, and in 1999, there's Paulus in New York with her mother as a child. And in 1999, she opened The Donkey Show, a disco-inspired adaptation of Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream, with the leading roles all played by women. Swimming with Watermelons, a play about her parents' courtship in Japan, followed. As Paulus established herself and became a sought-after director of musicals, she recast the male lead in a revival of the musical Pippin, now played by Patina Miller, who you can see in the center. One of the investors in the Broadway production of Pippin was Japanese. Yamazaki Yoshito is president of Kyoto Tokyo, a longstanding concert promoter, and he feels strongly about engaging Japanese audiences with foreign culture. Wanting to contribute his own innovation to the industry, in 1995, the company presented its first musicals. Yamazaki was at the 2013 Tony Awards, you can see him right up there, where he collected the Best Revival of a Musical award as a co-producer of Pippin with his longtime American partners. A Japanese production of Pippin followed. I'm going to go back with biracial stars. This is Spanish-Japanese actor Yu Shiroda and Korean-Japanese-American Crystal Kay. Kyoto Tokyo now has 3 American Tony Awards on display in their Tokyo offices, and Yamazaki also produced the Japanese premiere of Paulus's musical Waitress, created by and centering women. Like so many musical theater industries, Japan relies on trans-regional exchange of musicals, artists, and audience, as I have begun exploring today with Takarazuka. And yet this history is scarcely acknowledged by scholars. What you see in green is the history that has not been acknowledged or written about by scholars. What you see in black is the basic history of Japanese musical theater. Whether the green is for Michigan State or whether it's for the germination, I hope to promote with my research remains to be seen, but thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Laura. We have about 10 minutes, and I think rather than taking a lot of time to make comments myself, I'll open it up for questions to the audience, but just a brief summary. I found much in common and a lot of reverberations across all of the papers today, and just the proposition that the trans-regional can include different methodologies, exchanges, and especially I was impressed by the performativity in each of these stories, whether the medical actors, the propaganda posters, the images, and then the musical performers and the delegations, the performance of friendship, and other ideologies and ideas, as Ignatius shared. And just showing us this idea of mutual learning. I think all of these historical investigations show us some of the origins of tropes and discourses about Africa, Asia, and American musical performances, but also the ways that people-to-people approaches, delegations, and tours can really, this kind of history can illuminate counter discourses and the real experience of lived people in these times. And just lastly, to appreciate the historicizing, to see that these things changed over time in relatively short time periods, of the Indian one, of course, being quite dramatic in terms of the quickness of shifts in the politics between the two nations. So I'll stop there and open it up. We have about 10 minutes for Q&A before we go to the next panel. If you, yeah. Carol? Oh, yeah, there's a microphone there in the audience too. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Hello. Yeah. Hi. Thank you all for your wonderful presentations. My name is Anahit Hardam. I'm an associate professor of sociology at Howard University. My question is for Yasser. Thank you very much. It's also a very self-interested question, given my own research. So I'm curious about the Asian Solidarity Committee, if you've come across that, which kind of like becomes instrumental in the past post-Bandung era to establishing the African Asian Solidarity Committee in Cairo, and if you can tell us about that.
Yeah, so I haven't come across too much. Okay, I haven't come across them too much. So I have come across like there were different chapters of like Asian solidarity, either committees or organizations in different countries. What is sort of interesting is most of them get set up in the early 1950s, and they're using the same language that I discussed. But as soon as Suez happens, and there's suddenly this big interest in what's going on in Egypt in particular, they adopt almost overnight the language of like Afro-Asian solidarity. So there's a very big shift, but no one really seems to acknowledge it. It just seems to be that, okay, there was this struggle in Asia that was happening with the wars in Indochina and obviously with Korea. But there is a sudden like shift in imperialist interest towards Africa was how they were reading the situation. And so that's why they diverted their attention. But in terms of like the actual activities of the Asian Solidarity Organization, the big one that comes to mind is 1955. There's a conference in Delhi that they organized, and this is sort of a couple days before Bandung. And so it's sort of seen as like the people's equivalent. So I'd be happy to talk about that more if you'd like to. But yeah, that's what I know.
Thank you so much. I'm Lina Ben Abdallah. I'm Associate Professor of Politics at Wake Forest University. This was an amazing panel. The papers spoke to one another in really amazing ways. The question I have is maybe since the focus is also kind of cross-temporal, so thinking about past, present, and also future, I want to ask you to tell us maybe how, if you've kind of encountered or reflected on sort of the controversial legacies of this sort of global South or South-South solidarity at the Bandung, in the sense that obviously, yes, sir, I was very kind of reminded of the argument that Adom Getachew makes in the World Making After Empire book, where she argues that these decolonial project and this project of solidarity, the South-South solidarity, these were not random. They were not just acts of, we just have shared interest in the project, but these were projects of reordering. These are projects of world making. They are projects of shaping a different world order. But then at the same time, when we think about the present moment, right? Where is that horizontality, right? So where are we at when we think about, are we still in a place where, Africa, China, sort of medical diplomacy, is that still a place of thinking about horizontality, or are we in a different type of verticality? And what does that mean? Sort of with Ignatius, you mentioned that this comrade yet distant other, like close comrade, but at the same time a distant other. How do you think about sort of these, the way this is morphed, right, from the periods that you were looking at to the present time? Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, it's a heavy question, but thank you for it. It's an important one. So I think my read on this would be that this horizontality is born out of this particular moment, right? So there's this desire to world make and make this new sort of international order. And I think it's in response to the Cold War and these renewed threats of colonial activity and ongoing colonial activity. But because I think of the nature of that world order and system, that those like attempts to build solidarity really fail. I mean, really, actually, I don't want to speak for everyone on the panel, but I think what we study are projects that failed and that we are living in their ruins in a way. And so what you have now is like people still speaking in that language. So like in China and India and elsewhere, people still speak in the language of the non-aligned movement and horizontality and equality. but they don't really want to destroy the old world system. I think they just want to take it over, right? So I mean, if I think about how the Indian government talks about solidarity, it's very clear that they don't want to like destroy the world order. They just want to replace the Americans. And so that's a very different vision of the future. And so I'm very pessimistic about that, but I think the new moment of sort of solidarity is less these nation states talking to each other, because I think they've become stultified and they've ossified, but it's just people just trying to find solidarity and these liberatory moments between themselves. And you see this with Palestine, you see it with any struggle ongoing today, I think. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Lena. So yeah, this is a very great question and something I've been thinking about a bit. So this presentation today that I talked about, that's part of a bigger project. The title of that project is actually Beyond Solidarity. That's the initial one. And so just thinking about that discourse, and I feel like even within that effort and rhetoric of horizontality, there still existed some vertical relations within that framework. And so what I aim to show in this particular work is to look, ask the question of why was this even happening and in whose interest that was happening, right? And solidarity as a framework of thinking about this, I feel has not really changed much. It was more revolutionary discourse focused. Today, it's still pretty much the same kind of rhetoric that is around, well, Africans are our brothers, and in practice that has, manifested in economic security and multiple other engagements. But this rhetoric still around solidarity is still prevails. And what I feel is when we try to talk about grassroots interactions and people-to-people engagements, the notions of solidarity masks what people are actually experiencing. So for instance, if I am in, and I could go on a story, but no. So for instance, ideas that we have, they are our African brothers or Fejo Xiongdi, and because of that, they cannot be discriminated against or treated badly or with ill intent, right? And so whenever these things in contemporary African communities in China pop up, whenever these issues arise, state response becomes, well, we are friends. Like it still goes back to that same framework as a way of, justifying or juxtaposing intention versus effect, so to speak. So yeah, I feel like that horizontality that was being preached, if I may use that term, through the Mao period of, Africans, we're trying to form an alliance on equal footing, still has within it existing scales that we were talking about earlier that we need to pay a little bit more attention to. And that's what I'm trying to do, within this. The question is, who is producing this? Why are we even in it? And for what? To what end?
I'll just briefly follow up because those were excellent comments. But I didn't have the chance to obviously speak about my entire dissertation project today, but the first 3 chapters are about what Yasser correctly termed these histories of failure. So the first 2 alliances I showed do fade away. They don't last. But what I find both with the medical delegations and with these earlier alliances is that even these histories of failure on like an alliance level, they don't erase these personal connections. So like the president of the UPC, this banned leftist opposition party, he and his wife they'd arranged in advance of his death that if he were to be assassinated, that their daughter should be sent to China. And that's what happens. He is assassinated by the French in 1960. And his widow, who's herself an anti-colonial activist, sends their daughter to China, and the daughter stays there even after China drops its support for the UPC. And similarly, there are all of these Cameroonian healthcare workers who speak in such glowing terms about their own relationships with individual Chinese doctors and what they learned from them, and how, they've now been able to have their own acupuncture practice as a result. while at the same time, they're still critical of the ways in which the care became more commercialized, et cetera. So yeah, it depends again on the scale that you're looking at it.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question if the question is brief and the respondents are briefer. So Yanxio, I think you had a question, and then we can, I think some of you, the others that have questions can take it up during the break and the reception later. Thank you.
Of course, thank you, Jamie. I will try to be brief. I wonder for the panelists who use the images in your presentation or in your larger project, whether you can ground your analysis of those images a little bit more in the existing visual language of depicting foreigners in those existing traditions, because in both China and Japan, right, there is a much longer artistic tradition of depicting foreigners, and whether you see any changes by the time period you work on, I think that can give us a little bit more of a sense of the context. Thank you.
I think I want to look at more is the use of makeup because it was used at the direction of Americans and at the direction of Japanese. So there was this kind of common agreement that to represent Americans, we need to make a modification. And of course, other choices, singing style, choreography, help to represent the foreigner. But it's not an accident that Takarazuka is regularly representing foreigners on stage. So I think it's gotten more and more fantastical. I saw a musical Bonnie and Clyde at Takarazuka days after a shooting on the campus of MSU. And that was really troubling because of how playful they were with weapons on stage. So it was so far away from the reality of Americans. It wasn't anywhere near an accurate representation, nor did they seek to be accurate.
Oh, okay, this is not working, right? Thank you very much. Yes, so didn't get time to get into that, but with posters, I think thinking about it within the broader discourses that were going on at the time, but also thinking about it within, and I think the trans-regional emerges here, right? Because propaganda posters in China drew on socialist realism and adapted that from Russia, from the Soviet Union, with Soviet artists employed in art schools in Hangzhou and teaching Chinese artists how to produce these posters. So it was a relatively new art form that came with Mao in the 1950s, but the trans-regional connections emerged from there. So during the Sino-Soviet split, of course, these artists were sent away, but what they taught were not adopted wholesale. These were integrated with other forms of Chinese painting. But one thing I would say that stands out is that propaganda posters as a visual form was one of the, if not the first, that actually centered people, right? Prior to that, traditional Chinese painting focused more on landscapes and animals and the fantastical, and I mean, and strong men, pretty much like emperors, right? But with propaganda posters, we begin to see people that we cannot identify, pretty much the masses in that sense. Yeah, but we can talk more about that.
All right. I just want to thank all of the panels once again. It was really a rich panel, and we'll be back for the next panel in just a few minutes, I think.